In this lecture, we turn our attention to the negative network externality effect, which is also known as the Snob effect. So the starting point is that we've already discussed the positive network externalities, which is also called the bandwagon effect, in the previous video. Now we focus on the negative network externality effect, and that is called the Snob effect. What does it mean? It means that a greater number of market participants or a greater number of people who demand a certain good and buy a certain good reduces the usefulness of the product to those who buy it. For example, this could be luxury items, where if many people use them, they lose the characteristic of a luxury item, so it may not anymore signal to be a very special person to be able to afford this item. Or, for example, also congestion on roads. So if more people use roads, they get more congested, average speed slows down, and that reduces the usefulness of using the roads for all the participants. How can we look at this from a graphical perspective? Let's start again with a situation of a low user base, so when not many people use the service or the good. In this case, demand would be comparatively high to the situations that I will cover later on. So as we draw it here, we again have the demand for the good on the horizontal axis, the price of the good on the vertical axis, and we assume that we start with an initial price of 30, leading to the demand level here, slightly below 10. Now it's important that the consumers here value the good precisely because it has some exclusivity, so not many people use it yet, so it's a low user base. Now assume that the price of the good decreases. So if nothing else changes and the user base would not change, then we would move along the demand curve to a lower price level and a higher demand level, so the people would be willing to buy much more of that particular good for the lower price. So that's quite the standard effect that we already know. However, at the same time, of course, the good becomes cheaper to everybody else and they also increase demand. So we would move from a low user base at some point to a high user base. And in this case, that would shift the demand curve to the left, because for each price level, the good becomes less useful to the customer. For example, because the jewelry that you have is not anymore a luxury item, everybody can buy it and therefore it loses the exclusivity. So for this person with that demand curve, it would reduce demand by quite a bit for the same price. So the demand curve shifts to the left. This increase in the user base that is induced by lowering of the price decreases the usefulness of the product for the customers in the first place. Now we can again draw a new demand curve by connecting the initial optimal consumption point and the new optimal consumption point. And in this case, we see that the demand curve is much steeper in terms of the slope. Although the steepness is not the same as the elasticity, what we would have in this case here is that demand becomes much less elastic. And then we can again decompose the total effect into the price effect and now the Snob effect, the externality effect. So we move from the initial situation here to the new situation with a higher demand and a much lower price P2. Here. So the total effect is the first arrow here, which is comparatively small. The pure price effect would have been much greater because we would have ended up here with a very large reaction in demand for this price decrease. But this is compensated by the Snob effect to a large extent. So this effect that the good becomes less desirable because more people use it, that compensates for most of the increase in demand that would be due to the pure price effect, so that the total effect is much smaller. So to summarize, we have seen that in the presence of negative network externalities, the number of users reduces an individual's willingness to pay for this particular good, and as a result, the demand function becomes much less price elastic. And again, we can decompose the total effect into the change in demand that is due to the pure price effect and the change that is due to the Snob effect. And in this case, we would see that the two effects work in opposite direction, and the pure price effect is compensated to some degree by the Snob effect. So it's exactly the opposite of the bandwagon effect, the positive network externality, so that this completes our discussion of network externalities altogether, because we had both of these important cases now.